In this last segment on the New Deal and Franklin Roosevelt, I'd like to focus on two things in particular. And one of those is the Roosevelt Coalition, which I'm going to argue was really sort of short-lived in its full-blown form. But the second thing I want to argue, and it's sort of a matter of setting the stage or foreshadowing what's to come later in the 20th century after the Second World War, I'd like to try and foreshadow how this Roosevelt Coalition and how the New Deal set a pattern that would not only shape American life and government's role in it, but would shape the politics of the later 20th century. And I won't go into all those politics, of course, but I just like to set the stage and maybe point you in a particular direction. The election of 1936 would, of course, be Franklin Roosevelt's first re-election campaign. It explains, I think, in part why this astute politician seeks the second New Deal, seeks that legislation to sort of deal with his critics in advance of the 1936 election. In that election, he faces a Republican from Kansas, Governor Alf Landon. But by and large, Roosevelt, you could say, didn't have too much to fear. He wins every state but Maine and Vermont, and wins huge majorities in the House and the Senate. For all of the criticism that had been launched at Franklin Roosevelt and his programs and policies, it seemed that the American people were by and large in favor of Roosevelt's efforts on their behalf. It's here, in this election of 1936, that we begin to see the coalition form, in its full-blown form, shall we say. Roosevelt's union legislation, his legislation in terms of organized labor, his relief efforts, the relief programs, had all been important to the urban poor and to the working class. His efforts on behalf of farmers and farm prices had drawn to him the support of farmers, for instance, those in Kansas, where Alf Landon was from, but where he made no headway. Interestingly enough, this coalition would also bring together African American voters from across the nation that had traditionally voted Republican since Reconstruction, since the Civil War, and the Democrats of the Solid South. And that's kind of an amazing thing, that you could have these Democrats from the Solid South in the same coalition with African Americans and working class African Americans and professionals from the North. One of Roosevelt's first efforts after the election is to take what he conceives of as a mandate, the support of the American people, and go after one of the most important voices that had criticized and really helped to undermine his first efforts with the New Deal. In 1936, he wanted to see that the Supreme Court could not invalidate those pieces of legislation that had been passed in the mid-1930s. Now, the court was divided. Roosevelt understood this. In February of 1937, Roosevelt proposes a new scheme or law to govern the court. It's known as the Judiciary Reorganization Bill, which would have given Franklin Roosevelt the power to add a federal judge whenever an incumbent of 10 years refuses to retire within 6 months of reaching the age of 70. In other words, when a federal judge got close to 70 years of age, within just a few months, then refused to retire by age 70, the President, Roosevelt, would be authorized to appoint another judge, another federal judge of his own choosing. Remember that under the Constitution, when it comes to the appointment of federal judges, Congress has the authority to oversee that. Now, that doesn't necessarily apply to the Supreme Court. But where this Judiciary Act, or bill, I should say, does matter is that Roosevelt would have the authorization to appoint an additional 50 federal judges including 6 judges to the Supreme Court. Now, the number on the court, remember, it's not really set in the Constitution. It's part of the larger responsibility of Congress. And the number of judges on the Supreme Court has changed over time during the course of American history. So what Roosevelt is trying to get at here is, one, his ability to shape the federal judiciary, but he's also trying to obtain the power to expand the number of judges on the Supreme Court in such a way as to create a court that is more sympathetic to his own legislative agenda. It's one of those rare times when Franklin Roosevelt manages to sort of alienate everybody. Sort of across the board, regardless of political position, liberals, those who supported New Deal measures or progressives, conservatives, Democrats, Republicans, pretty much unanimously said, no. This piece of legislation, if we pass it, would give the President of the United States extraordinary powers to control the judicial branch of government. And so it cannot be allowed to happen. Seeing the response of his own party, led in no small part by conservative Southern Democrats, Roosevelt is forced to concede defeat. This so-called court-packing scheme would seem to be one of the great low points of his administration. It's a failure. As if this astute politician has misread the political opinion of constituents and also of his own party and the opposition party. I'm not entirely sure. It's one of those points in history where you can look at this in different ways. Either Roosevelt just failed to get it right, or he understood that what was most important in 1937 was not that he actually controlled the court, but that he shape or influence the court's decisions. In other words, it may have been less important to Roosevelt that he actually get his judges on the court than it was important to Roosevelt that he let the court know if they didn't change their opinions, if they didn't vote more kindly to Roosevelt's legislative agenda, he would use his political power against them to limit their authority, to reduce their influence. During the debate over the court-packing scheme, as this episode came to be known, the 2 swing judges, these are judges whose vote ultimately decided the matter, whether pro or against, the 2 swing judges on the Supreme Court began to vote more and more sympathetically to the New Deal. In spring of 1937, the court upheld the Wagner Act in the case of the National Labor Relations Board versus Jones and Laughlin, and basically said that Congress did have power through the Interstate Commerce Clause to regulate interstate commerce, and that involved the ability to regulate not merely commerce, but the production of goods. Also, the court upheld Social Security. We also have then, following the court-packing scheme, the retirement of a number of justices and federal judges, which will allow Franklin Roosevelt over the course of the next 4 years to nominate 7 new judges to the federal judiciary. Is it a loss for Roosevelt? Well, probably not. I mentioned, too, a little bit earlier that Roosevelt seemingly was not, how do I put this, that he was interested in a balanced budget, that he was in some ways quite conservative in his economic thinking. One of the instances of this conservatism is probably to be seen in Roosevelt's effort beginning in 1936 as he begins to see certain statistical changes in the economic numbers. Roosevelt begins to seek to pull back federal expenditures just a bit. Arguably, that means that he had never lost his commitment to a balanced budget. By 1937, it would have appeared perhaps that the worst of the Great Depression was over, that his own policies, those New Deal programs, had fundamentally begun to work. The reason, very simply, we began to see unemployment dropping, so that by 1937, it's actually down to about 7.7 million. Now, that's a long way from the 25% unemployment we were seeing at the beginning of Roosevelt's administration. But what happens basically is that as the Federal Reserve becomes worried that the dropping unemployment, that the kind of upswing in the economy will lead to higher inflation, actually they're worried about inflation at this point, Roosevelt tightens the purse strings. Partly a response to his conservative critics, but he tightens the purse strings. Everything's looking up. What follows is a recession, not a depression, not a downturn in the economy necessarily, but a massive slowdown in the economy. Federal funds being pumped into the economy were keeping it growing, keeping it moving, keeping it pulling out of its Great Depression lows. When Roosevelt pulled back on the strings, the result was unemployment went back up. Indicators went down. By 1938, that 7.7 million unemployed had risen again to 10.4 million. What this suggests is that there's still a place in the 1930s for the New Deal, that it's having an impact. But as I've suggested, it will be the Second World War before you could argue the United States has pulled out of the Great Depression. When I say there's still reason for the New Deal, let me suggest just a little bit, and I don't want to spend too much time on this, though it's an extremely important topic. But let me suggest that one of the indicators there was still a need for the New Deal in the 1930s was the Dust Bowl. The Dust Bowl was an environmental event that lasts from 1935 to 1940, when a massive drought affects particularly the plains states. And we're talking about an area, and while this changes some over time, we're talking about an area that would include parts of Nebraska and Kansas, Oklahoma, Texas, New Mexico, Colorado, vast swaths of the Great Plains, the sort of high plains. The high plains are arid. They're inherently arid. And if you think back on kind of the American progression of settlement, it was really in the latter 19th century that Americans began to move. Of course, they'd already moved beyond the Mississippi, but move out of the sort of Middle West or the Midwest into these higher, more arid areas to dry farm. That's the term that's used, right? To dry farm. You're going to have to dig wells. You're going to have to try to find aquifers. You're not going to be able to count on a whole lot of rain. Farmers had taken with them for this dry farming many of the skills that had been developed elsewhere. And so what we can often think of as an environmental disaster, this so-called Dust Bowl, will actually be a cultural disaster as well. How Americans approached the land and the environment, their ideas about what the environment was, had allowed them to farm in such a way as to really destroy the soil and prepare the soil for the environmental disaster that comes in the 1930s and into the early 1940s. This environmental disaster, which we call the Dust Bowl, and was the result of drought and arid conditions, basically meant the removal of tons and tons of topsoil from the Great Plains. There were instances of massive black sandstorms, dirt storms, that would just overwhelm, and hopefully we'll have a chance to show you some of the images that were captured of the experiences. It was impossible for families to keep dust out of their homes. It's not a reflection of the hygiene or the capacity of these people or desire of these people to maintain clean homes. It was a matter of you just couldn't keep the dust out. There are occasions and there are images, which again I hope you'll have a chance to see, of vast black clouds that blew from the Great Plains and stretched across the Mississippi and actually encompassed Washington, D.C. Tons and tons and tons of topsoil being removed by these high, dry winds. Massive dust storms. But the consequences of the Dust Bowl were felt by the families themselves, by the farmers, by these people who could no longer make a living on the land. They'd always struggled, but now there was no way. Where do they go? What do they do? Many of them, as John Steinbeck records in books like The Grapes of Wrath, many of them would become the Okies of myth, and they would set out, not just myth, that's what they were called though, and they would set out for sort of opportunity and the promise of California, leaving behind farms, leaving behind land, leaving behind houses that are being blown and destroyed by the sands and the soil, getting on those old Model T trucks and heading west toward the sort of promised land, or so it may have seemed, to become the pickers of vegetables and day laborers. There's an amazing demographic shift in American history. It's like the Great Migration in a way. But the reason I bring it up, and I encourage you to consider, finding out more about the Dust Bowl on your own. But the reason I bring it up is to suggest that in the mid-1930s, the crisis hadn't passed. In some ways because the crisis never was about the Great Depression. It never was about those specific years of the early 1930s. Instead, the tension and the crisis had been part of American economic history for decades. It had been cultural. How we look at the land, how we look at production, how we look at all these various questions that make up American society as the United States had become a great power in the world, as the United States had industrialized. There were unresolved questions, and that's why I think we see in the New Deal not just the immediate relief of people affected by the Depression, but oftentimes efforts by the sort of brain trust, by Roosevelt's advisors, to push an agenda that seeks to address long-term problems in America. That lies behind the New Deal, but it lies behind that Roosevelt coalition as well. And I just want to add a few little facts here as we go. Under the Wagner Act, the issue of collective bargaining, the issue of unionization, while it wasn't settled, would be changed tremendously, would continue to affect the United States and its manufacturing through the 20th century. By 1938, union membership had risen to over 7 million. But we also see during this period the emergence of an organization that would compete with the American Federation of Labor. In 1935, John L. Lewis of the United Mine Workers formed a committee of industrial organizations within the AFL, which would be dedicated not merely to the ideas of the American Federation of Labor, but to the workers who worked, often unskilled workers, who worked in those industries of production that we had seen emerging through the 19-teens and in the late 19th century. These are industrial unionists, semi-skilled, and even unskilled workers. 1938, the AFL expelled the CIO, the Congress of Industrial Organizations as it became. And in that year, the CIO took off as a sort of competitive organization with approximately 3.4 million members. The result would be successes for labor. 1936, for instance, would see a massive sit-down strike at the General Motors Fisher Body Plant in Flint, Michigan, in which the United Auto Workers, part of the CIO insurgency within the AFL, but the United Auto Workers ended up winning recognition. You remember, that's the thing that labor could seldom come up with. Steel workers with U.S. Steel won an 8-hour day, 40-hour week. Again, however you feel about labor organizations, it's imperative here to understand the shift that's taking place in no small part because of Roosevelt's policies. And as a result, you can come to understand why labor would be such a dedicated part of this Roosevelt coalition within the Democratic Party. For African Americans, too, there's a story of how they come to be part of this coalition. By and large, Roosevelt doesn't do a heck of a lot for African Americans. And one of the key examples of his hesitancy to alienate Southern conservative white Democrats is his failure to support anti-lynching legislation that would seek to use federal authority to stop this violence against African Americans, particularly in the South, but nationwide. The fact is that in 1930, 3/4 of all African Americans still lived in the South. And almost all African Americans were prevented from jury service and from voting. They were denied access to the best hospitals, universities, parks. They were restricted oftentimes to the most menial jobs, even in industry, where many industries they simply couldn't work on the line. They were left to sweep up, to perform, unskilled labor of the most menial type. African American life expectancy, 1930, was 10 years lower than that for whites. 1929, there were 7 lynchings. In 1933, there were 24. Unemployment was worse for African Americans by far than it was for whites. And it's a notable piece of the puzzle. I've suggested in hinting ways how some of this worked. Roosevelt was worried about Southern Democrats. They have that conservative voice about using government power, federal government power, to the extreme. And I've suggested then how programs like the AAA could play into the hands of these Southern conservatives, for instance, planters who continued to own land and would expel sharecroppers so that the parity payments would go into their own pockets. But I think it's also to understand that it wasn't just the AAA. The National Industrial Recovery Act had allowed for the dispossession, because it set a minimum wage, of the most menial laborers. And what that means is that if I've got to pay a minimum wage and somebody's got to go, I've got to get rid of some job so that I can afford to pay that minimum wage, then the first person to go will most likely be the African Americans. Certainly it's true in the South, but it's broader than that. One of the sort of nicknames for the National Recovery Administration was in fact the Negro Removal Act, because the pain that came was often pain felt by African Americans. The CCC, the TVA, many organizations were segregated. And remember, African Americans, many of them, because of the type jobs they had, were excluded from Social Security. You put all that together, and it doesn't make a lick of sense why African Americans would come to support Franklin Roosevelt, and yet they did. And if anything, I suppose it had as much to do with his public pronouncements, with the game that he talked, and with the way he treated African Americans. And I'll throw in one more thing, his own wife, Eleanor Roosevelt, and the relationships she developed in the African American community. Roosevelt invited African Americans to the White House. He created what he called his Black Cabinet, which was a group of educated African American professionals and advisors. And while the New Deal programs were segregated, there were opportunities for African Americans within the segregated elements of the New Deal. Over the course of the 30s, something amazing happens in American politics. And that is that African Americans shift from the Republican Party and support for it, the party of Lincoln, to the Democratic Party. that is going to set up so much in the latter 20th century that we'll see happening with Democratic Party politics and ultimately with the rise of the new right in American politics. One last little bit of the puzzle here. The Indian Reorganization Act of 1934. One of the things Roosevelt does is restore tribal lands to tribal ownership, forbid the future division of tribal lands into individual parcels, and provide loans to Native Americans for economic development and self-government. For the first time, elements of the Bureau of Indian Affairs begins to suggest the possibility that Native American culture should be preserved. It's not a great deal. A lot of it's lip service, okay. But compared to what other presidents had to offer, you could argue that Roosevelt sets a new tone in regard to multiple groups within American society. These groups, many of them will find a place within the Democratic Party, and that sets the stage for the politics of the 20th century. As William Leuchtenberg wrote, historian William Leuchtenberg, quote, "For the first time for many Americans, the federal government became an institution that was directly experienced. More than state and local governments, it came to be the government." And I told you at the beginning of this lecture, the little exercise I did with students and asked them to envision a symbol for government. And most often I found that they went to Washington, D.C. for their symbolisms. I would argue that the New Deal laid the foundations for what's come to be defined as America's welfare system. That notion that's pushed through public policy that government has a distinct role to play, especially among those who are least able to make it on their own in this society, those who have been discriminated against, those who have been or who face just massive odds, that government has a role to play. Roosevelt laid the foundations for that, but arguably he also laid the foundations for what other historians have called the imperial presidency, the expansion of executive power in this country, making the presidency the strongest branch of government. But in one major way, regardless of its impact, the New Deal failed. As late as 1939, more than 10 million men and women were still jobless. Unemployment ran at approximately 19.1%. And in the end, it was not to be the New Deal, but rather the Second World War, its massive expenditures and the changed global economic situation that would lift the United States out of economic depression. Already, by 1938, Franklin Roosevelt's attention was turning away from domestic affairs and to the growing clouds of war that seemed on the horizon from Europe and in the Pacific. It's an amazing, amazing moment in American history, I think, the 1930s, the New Deal, because it sets the stage for so much that is to follow.